We were talking about the belief systems of conservatives the last time we met and the last time that we uploaded videos, correct? And we had talked about their economic views, and I think we were talking about social views too, right? Okay, so we talked about LGBT issues and how Republicans are like, look, we just believe in a traditional lifestyle and things like same-sex marriage. We don't believe is acceptable. We think that society, civilization, human civilization has always said that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's how we see things. Uh, what would they say about the issue of, I think we mentioned this in the video too, transgender restroom usage or transgender students who want to play sports? What is it? It's unfair if we let them go with what they feel like, because female athletes, like for example, Fry, you're a volleyball player, correct? And are you attempting to see if you can play in college? Okay. And would you feel frustrated if you had a scholarship opportunity and you had to compete with somebody who has more testosterone than you? It would definitely be harder. And we're not invalidating those people's feelings. We're just saying that they would have a competitive advantage. And conservatives would say, we don't support that. We mentioned abortion. We mentioned gun laws that ultimately people who are conservative believe you have the right to keep and bear arms. That's enshrined in the Constitution and the Second Amendment. And we last talked about capital punishment. Okay. And we said, look, conservatives look at capital punishment and say, look, sometimes some crimes are so ugly, so heinous that the only way to get justice, to balance the scales, is by taking a life. And it shouldn't be used in every situation, but there are some situations, some very awful situations where people do ugly, horrible things. Okay. And that they believe it's a deterrent. They believe it's an effective way to make sure somebody doesn't do it again. And another thing here, too, is they think of it in terms of cost effectiveness. It costs about, in America, about $40,000 a year to house someone in prison. And they're like, why are we paying $40,000 a year to house somebody in prison when they have committed such a horrible crime that we don't think they deserve to live? Right? And remember, I'm not saying you have to agree with that. I'm saying this is what their position is. Would conservatives say that the primary reason for incarceration is to rehabilitate people or to punish people? What do they want to see happening to prisoners primarily? Punishment or rehabilitation? You would think so, but no. They're like, hey, ultimately, like, think of it this way. What if somebody proposed a law saying we should start an education program for prisoners that will cost $5 million a year? How would conservatives look at that? They would not like that. They're like, look, we could spend $5 million on just about anything other than people who've committed crimes. They're there because they did something bad. They know they did something bad. And for some people, they're beyond rehabilitation. All right. Let's move forward. Let's talk about immigration policies and conservatives. Let me guess. Immigration, conservatives don't want any immigrants here at all, right? Just kidding. No, what is the position that conservatives have on immigration? They need to do it legally. We have a set up process and a system for how you should come to this country. And if you want to become a citizen, how you go about that. Right? And what good is it to have a set of established rules if people are just going to ignore them? All right. They also look at the situation and say, hey, we can't let everybody come in here. Okay. Why not? Why can't we just let anybody come into the country? What would happen if we did that? Number one, you have to make sure that they're good people. All right. What's the right reason for them to be here? Okay. What's another reason? What would happen to the numbers of immigrants if America said, look, as long as you don't have a criminal record, we'll take you? There'd be a lot of people that would want to come, and we would be overwhelmed. Okay. So we have a real problem with that. Here's another problem they have with it, too. Do you know how many illegal immigrants are in the country right about now? Somewhere in the neighborhood of, best guess, 10 to 15 million. That's literally like 7 times the population of West Virginia. Right? That's a lot of people. 330 million is our total population, and a substantial amount we think are illegal immigrants. And they're like, hey, those people, are getting various resources. For instance, public schools. Do you know, even if I suspect somebody is an illegal immigrant, I'm not allowed to ask. Schools have to take you, regardless of your immigration status, and they're not allowed to even ask. So if a kid shows up, we're like, where do you live? And we fill out the necessary paperwork as they need it, and they're going to come to school every day. So your resources go to educating illegal immigrants. Okay, let's move right along. Marijuana and drug usage. Okay, what would the GOP or conservatives say about marijuana? It should be illegal. We should keep it that way. It's a mind altering substance that does not do any good for people. That literally, this is a substance that harms people. Okay, that and older people would use this phrase. It's a what type of drug? Gateway drug. Okay, and there's a lot of debate about that, whether it is or not. I know this for a fact. There are many people who use marijuana who do not go on to use harder drugs. Okay, just because you use marijuana doesn't mean you're going to turn into a heroin addict. However, the people that use lots of hardcore drugs, what do you think they probably started with? Marijuana or alcohol, I would guess. Marijuana and alcohol are the drugs that people go to first. And so people who are conservatives are like, hey, this substance is of no use to us. Literally, it doesn't provide any value. Some conservatives could probably be swayed on medical marijuana, but they're like, hey, for recreational use, just because you want to get high, no. There are better ways to live, right? And they're like, hey, drugs are literally bad, toxic substances to your body. We don't allow other drugs for the same reason, right? And some of you are like, yeah, but then there's some of you like, I don't know about that. Kazu, you look like you got a question. Great question. And people bring into question cigarettes, tobacco usage. Okay. The one thing I would say about this, like nicotine and cigarettes, even though they are definitely not good for your health, they are not mind altering. Okay. That yes, you can become addicted to them, but you're not going to, like, for example, if somebody was high on marijuana, would you want them driving a car? Absolutely not. Okay. But if somebody was smoking a cigarette, the worst thing happens, you get some secondhand smoke and it smells really bad. Great question. Alcohol is definitely something that people use to question marijuana. They're like, hey, alcohol is arguably, and I would say you could put up a good argument that it's a worse substance than marijuana. Okay. And those are things that you have to personally internalize and figure out for yourself, where do I stand on that? So you're raising valid questions about drug use and marijuana, but you have to figure that out for yourself. The only thing I would tell you is that people would probably come at you and say, well, alcohol, for example, drinking a glass of wine, even though it's not like necessarily something you do, it has caloric value where, it's nutritional. That wine has calories, it has sugar in it, carbohydrates. There is like actual nutritional value to it, whereas marijuana has none. All right. You don't look like you're buying that explanation, and you don't have to. Okay. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about traits of people who are conservatives. Okay. Conservatives, do they tend to be older or younger? They tend to be older. Okay. They tend to be older. All right. And look, you have to realize this about old people in general. Do old people like things to change? No, they get set in their ways, and so they might like a system that has benefited them. Do people who are conservatives, do they tend to be religious or non-religious? Definitely on the religious side. Okay. Oftentimes, religions are very traditional in their approach to things. All right. People who are conservatives, do they tend to be highly educated or not so highly educated? Not so highly educated. Now, please don't confuse that with education with intelligence level. All right? Because I want you to think of the worst teacher you've ever had. Don't say any names, but think of the worst teacher you ever had. They had a college degree. Technically, they're highly educated. All right? Now, think of somebody in your life that you know never finished college, but yet they're very intelligent. Okay? For me, it's my mom and dad. They're very smart people, but they do not have like a higher level of education. Okay? All right. So, ultimately, conservatives, they tend to be older, they tend to be religious, not always highly educated. And what, where would you tend to find them? Rural areas or urban areas? Definitely rural areas. Okay. In particular, what region of the country? The dirty South. You're like, oh yeah, those Southerners. I would do a Southern accent, but I just feel like it's inappropriate at this point. And if it gets recorded and somebody hears it, they might get offended. I know. It is a little on the boring side. I could, but that would take too much time. All right. Now, here's the thing. Uh, at this point, hopefully, somewhere in your head, you at least have a mindset of where you kind of fall in terms of your whether you're more liberal or more conservative. So, like Kaiser, I feel like you're pretty liberal. Okay. Anybody also feel like I'm in the liberal camp? Fry, that's definitely you. You think you are? All right. Now, here's the thing. You will never fall neatly on the political spectrum. It's okay if you don't agree with 100% of the views. Like a couple years ago, I was telling an earlier class, there was a student who was openly gay, but told me that's the only thing he had in common with liberals. And I was like, wow, that's unique because usually you don't see that. And he's like, yeah, I'm always torn because the people I want to vote for issues about LGBT issues are not the people I'd want to vote for any other reason. So he's like, every time I hear from him occasionally, he's like, every time I go to vote, it's a struggle. I'm like, wow, that's interesting. Okay. Now, even if you're not 100% liberal or conservative, there's still a place for people like you all. There's two other, what we would call uh, ideologies that you can buy into. All right. The first one are what we call libertarians or libertarianism. All right. And libertarians are when you have economic views that are more conservative, but your social views are liberal. Okay. And when that happens, we call those people libertarians. Economic views that are more conservative, social views that are more liberal. Does anyone here, does that describe you to any extent? Collins, you're like, that's me right there. And more young people, I used to never have any libertarians in my class, but even today, with only half of them here, I think I've had 4 or 5 that were definitely feel like they're in that camp. Okay, so if you have those economic views that are conservative and your social views are more liberal, you're libertarian. All right. Now, opposite of that, you have what's called populism. All right. And there's not like this is a term that's used by some political scientists. You may not see it by others, but that's the opposite of libertarians. When your economic views are more liberal and your social views are more conservative. Okay. And populists, these right here, probably traditional West Virginians. If you think about West Virginians, we are economically, we're pro-labor, pro-union. We benefit from social programs. We don't want the middle and lower socioeconomic classes taxed. All right. We're economic, but what are our social views? Definitely conservative, definitely traditional. All right. This is really descriptive of West Virginians when your economic views are liberal and your social views are conservative. Does that describe anybody in here? It's funny. I never get young people who are like this, who are in that populist zone. All right. So between liberalism and conservatism, we've got these two when you're part one and part the other. Okay. And something I want to show you too is that this is your political beliefs are like a spectrum. Okay. So imagine like an arc, and on the left, that's where you've got liberals. All right. And so if you're listening at home, something we use, if we say somebody is moving to the left, that means they're becoming more liberal on an issue. Like I'll give you a for instance, usually I don't interject my opinions, but when I was your all's age, I thought the death penalty was perfectly acceptable. And I was like, you know what? There's some people that deserve to die and we should execute them and we should execute them quickly. But as I've gotten older and educated and thought about this a lot, I've moved a little left on that one issue. It's not that I don't think some people might not deserve it, but I'm like, hey, there's a possibility we could execute somebody that's innocent. And that right there is enough to give me pause to reconsider. All right. So if you're moving to the left, that means you're becoming a little more liberal. Now, on the right side is where we put conservatives. Right. So if somebody says you're moving to the right, you're becoming more conservative. Right. Now, these aren't even the extremes. On the far left, way left of liberals, anybody know what goes over here? People that want the government in charge of a lot of different things, including business and regulations and putting some limitations on personal freedoms. Socialism or communism? Okay, I heard somebody say it over there. Socialism, communism. That's the extreme left. Okay, and over on the extreme right, way far to the right of conservatives, anybody know who goes on that end? I'll give you a hint. Think Nazi Germany. Starts with an F. Fascists or fascism. Now, fascism and socialism or communism don't really apply to us in this course. And so if you want to learn more about them, I'll tell you about that later on. But most people in America fall somewhere between liberals and conservatives. Okay? And we'd put libertarians and populists in that camp too. Most people fall somewhere in that range from liberal to conservative. Most Americans are not fascists. Most Americans are not communists, despite what people want to have you believe. Okay? Every time Republicans do something Democrats don't like, they point at them and call them fascists. Every time Democrats do something or propose something that Republicans don't like, they're like, they're communists. I know. Now, that leads me to my next point here, too. And I put this out of order on your outline a little bit, and I probably need to fix that. But notice that I put the term up here, moderates. Most Americans, even though they have specific political beliefs about something, most Americans will refer to themselves as moderates. Why do they call themselves moderates? When you ask them, be like, hey, how would you describe yourself? Liberal, conservative, moderate, what? They'll say moderate. Why would they say that? Even though they know definitively where they stand. Exactly why. All right. And what we're afraid of is getting labeled. Okay. Both sides have labeled the other side as something terrible. So, for example, when Kaiser says she's a liberal, all right, then anybody who's not a liberal automatically in their head, they've conjured up an image of some tree hugging hippie who's throwing rainbows out of her pockets all the time. And she wants to tax the rich and destroy everything that's good about America. Okay? And if somebody says they're a conservative, well, anybody who's not a conservative thinks, there's some religious right wing nut job who wants to take away all our freedoms and they just want to control women's bodies. Right? And that's not true either. Okay? People don't like being labeled or making presumptions. Like one of the things I would tell you too is that I've learned on social media, anytime I post something that is an article talking about what President Trump does when he does something weird or unusual, people automatically presume that I am some super left wing liberal. And I'm like, that's not true. Just because I criticize one side doesn't mean I belong to the other, right? Because as much as I get annoyed with Donald Trump, I also get annoyed with Nancy Pelosi, right? Both of them have very different political views, but I find them to both to be to the point where I just want to, run my head into a wall. All right. So, Americans don't necessarily don't like to be labeled. Okay. Now, let me stop our recording there if you're at home, and I'll explain further what to do.